Let me start by thanking you all for being here. And when I say that it's a real honour and that I appreciate it, I'm not exaggerating. I also want to thank colleagues in the events department without whose work this evening wouldn't have happened, and to dedicate this lecture to 4 people no longer alive: my parents, Božena, Helmut, and to my friends Graham Burton Laker and Elizabeth Kingdom. I need also to mention at least some of the other people from my past without whom I would not be standing here today. The head of my infant school, Mrs. Phillips. The wonderful Mr. Madison, who taught me at primary school and who had to put up with me. 3 of my secondary school teachers, Denby, Lockwood, Lucas, and less formally, now that we've got to the end of the 60s, and that's a giveaway, of course, Ray Farrer, who taught me how to teach. And then to my teachers at Kent, Larry, Richard, Tony, Sean, and especially Chris. My colleagues here at Brighton, whether teachers, students, or administrators. Your integrity and your resourcefulness, and above all your solidarity and friendship, have sustained and supported me over the years. I'm not going to embarrass you with names, that's for later. But thanks to, of course, to all my friends and colleagues elsewhere, whether here today or not, your friendship and support is no less important. So, philosophy. It's very odd to talk about the value of philosophy when half the present cabinet have degrees in philosophy, politics and economics from the University of Oxford. It looks like an uphill task. After all, if that's what philosophy does for you, it's not a very good advert. Still, I'll try, and I'll try to show you that we're not all in the same yacht. So, because philosophers, as my colleagues here in Brighton very well know, always do things in threes, I'm going to talk about 3 things this evening. About knowledge and belief, about how philosophy, abstract though it is nevertheless practical in as much as it can help us see that something is or is not true, and therefore what we should do about it. And as an example of philosophy's practicality, I'm going to say just a very little bit about capitalism and why it's immoral. And lastly, and as importantly as anything else, since philosophy is nothing if not conversation, we'll continue less formally over a few drinks. So, knowing and believing. Well, the first philosophical question I can really remember getting excited about was this: can we ever tell the difference between what we merely believe, or what we think we know, and what we really do know? And I'm still excited by this question because it matters so much. An example, if someone tells you they listen to God every morning for instructions, can you know that they don't in fact know what they think they know? Can you know that they only believe it because it's not true, and only what's true can be known? Or if someone's convinced that, say, Palestinian people, or Jewish or black people, or women are in some ways inferior to white men, can you know that they're wrong? Not in order to convince them, of course. That's all too unlikely. And anyway, there are far more important things to do with our time than trying to convince idiots. But rather to convince yourself that your judgment is actually right, and that you're therefore right when you act on that judgment. Because, of course, if you don't know that what racists believe is, as a matter of fact, wrong, you can't in turn know that you're right to fight racism. And that matters. It matters a lot. Now, of course, this isn't to say that we can always distinguish between what's known and what's only believed. An example might be, say, abortion, thought by many to be a paradigmatic moral dilemma. Do we know, or do we only believe whatever it is that we take the fetus to be in relation to persons? I don't think the answer's just obvious. There are problems here whichever way you go. And maybe it's not clear how to resolve them. That's why you might think it's a dilemma. But of course, it's a mistake to suppose that somehow morality is peculiarly susceptible to dilemmas. Dilemmas are commonplace in ordinary empirical matters too. Do you know, or do you merely believe that you should turn left at the next fork in the path? It could equally well, or badly, be either. Do you know, or do you merely believe that the risks of nuclear power outweigh its benefits, or vice versa? Nor, and this is important, does making this distinction between knowledge and belief suggest that we're infallible when we make it, however confident we might be. For instance, I know there's no life after death, but I also know that my knowledge, like everybody else's, is fallible, the Pope notwithstanding. Because what looks like knowledge often turns out only to have been belief. People once quite reasonably thought the earth was flat. We know it isn't, don't we? Hope we do. But that's of course because we now know more than they knew then. If we go back to morality, some philosophers, notoriously Aristotle, accepted slavery, thinking they knew what it turns out they only believed. Others, notoriously Kant, as some of you know, my hero, thought that women were not the equal of men, thinking they knew, but they didn't. They turn out to have only believed because it wasn't true. But that we can always turn out to be mistaken about what we think we know doesn't imply that the distinction between knowledge and belief is itself, after all, hazy or impossible. Quite the opposite. It's relativism, the view very broadly and roughly that there's no cross-cultural knowledge, so that different beliefs are all we have. It's relativism that has a hard time making sense of fallibility. And here's why. The distinction between knowledge and belief is clear enough, but people aren't always in a position to see it. But it's not that people who thought, for instance, that combustible things burn by giving off phlogiston were stupid or inattentive or somehow blameworthy. It's just that they didn't know about oxygen. They were simply mistaken. But what matters here is that the very idea of being mistaken requires exactly the distinction between knowing and believing that I'm talking about. If there really were no difference between knowing something and believing it, if knowing was just a very strong believing, which is basically what relativism claims, then there could be no question of being mistaken. Now that might sound odd, but I don't think it is. If we didn't know that the Earth was not flat, then we couldn't regard thinking that the Earth is flat as a mistake, but only as an alternative to the belief that it's roughly a globe. Again, mistakes are one of the things that makes it possible to distinguish knowing from believing. And the reality of mistakes shows that the distinction between knowing and believing holds, however fallibly. But of course, I've been simplifying things so far. This business of not being able infallibly to distinguish knowing from believing is actually a lot more complicated than I've allowed. Though the flat earth example, I think, already suggests how that complication works. I think we need here to distinguish between what I want to call positive knowledge from negative knowledge. Positive knowledge is hard to come by. It's unusual. Just what shape exactly is the Earth? Well, what shape is it? It's not exactly a globe, it's sort of flattened at either end. And to speak of either end already shows that it's not quite a globe. So what shape exactly is it? Very hard to say. I don't think I can. Somebody else might be able to. But of course, what shape the Earth is not it's not flat, it's not a cube and so on, is a lot easier. And I think this point is generalizable. Knowing what's not the case is far easier than knowing what is the case. And again, this is true of both factual or scientific knowledge and of moral or political knowledge. We very rarely know exactly what is the case. The exactly right dose of an anti-cancer drug, for instance. But we know very well that a whole range of doses, perhaps an indefinitely large range of doses, is not right. We're unlikely to know the exact length of the River Thames. Anybody? Just as well. But we do know it's not 50 miles, and we know it's not 500 miles, and so on. And as with factual or scientific knowledge, so with moral and political knowledge. Consider Israel's policies against the Palestinians. Or think about distributive justice, the question of how resources, wealth, should be shared among us. We might not know exactly what's right in those two cases, but we do know that a lot of things are wrong. And I'm going to come back to that distinction between positive and negative knowledge shortly. But first, I really want to emphasize this very general point that the knowledge-belief distinction holds in moral and political matters no less than in scientific ones. And I want to emphasize that because it's something I know the vast majority of philosophers are going to disagree with. We can, I think, at least sometimes know that something's right or wrong. Morality and politics aren't just a matter of what different people happen to believe. If you like to put it this way, and those of you who know me know I do like to put it this way, morality and politics are no less objective than anything else. Now that looks like a very strange claim. Maybe it is a very strange claim. Partly because I think the word objective is a word that very often puts people off. What does it mean? What does the claim amount to that some moral and political matters are objectively like this or like that? Well, this is where I go back to the notion of negative knowledge. What I have in mind when I say that a claim is objective is that all the alternatives to that claim have been ruled out, so far as we know, as not the case. How they've been ruled out is another matter. And here factual claims and moral, political claims, value claims, of course, do differ. The Thames isn't 5,000 miles long. Measure the thing and you'll see. What Israel's doing in Gaza is morally indefensible. Think about it and you'll see. So what does that mean? The measuring is relatively simple, I take it. But what's this thinking about it and see amount to? What does it mean? It's not like measuring. It's not concrete. It's not tangible. I think it means very roughly, and I know that many of you will disagree with this, it means thinking about whether or not it makes sense. That's to say, it's more like the difference between 3 and 2 is 5 and 3 and 2 is 7. The first makes sense, the second does not. Then it's like the difference between the Thames is 5,000 miles long and the Thames is roughly about 215 miles long. I know many of you disagree with that and that I'm putting too much weight on the possibility of making sense. And I hope we'll carry on argue about it, not just tonight, but for a good few years. But because of that, this seems a good moment to go off at a little bit of a tangent. Not a very long one, but a bit. To say something about the way I'm trying to proceed here. To say something about the importance of making mistakes in philosophy. Because I think that's an area of philosophical thought that is undervalued. The importance of making mistakes. Now you've noticed, obviously, I can see that you've noticed, that I've made some very strong claims and that I've done so pretty unapologetically so far. Now, I've been doing that deliberately, because philosophy, unlike just about any other academic discipline, isn't all about not making mistakes. In fact, philosophers need to allow themselves and to allow other people to make mistakes, to make lots of mistakes. Because it's in understanding how and why something actually is a mistake that we get to understand better the subject of the mistake. I'm going to quote Wittgenstein now, as those of you who know me is quite unusual, but he did say something very interesting once. Wittgenstein once said to a speaker at a philosophy seminar who just realized before they said it, they're about to say something really pretty silly, which we do all the time. No, say what you wanted to say. Be crude and we'll get there. I think that says something important about philosophy. If philosophy is not just to be a sort of sophisticated word game, which it sometimes looks like, if philosophy is to be serious, and I think philosophy has to be serious or it's not worthwhile at all, you know, back to those Oxford graduates drivelling on about the big society, then it's the mistakes that matter. We all know, after all, whether we think of ourselves as doing philosophy or not, we've been told often enough that we learn by making mistakes. But if that's going to work, if we are going to learn from our mistakes, instead of being intimidated by our mistakes, instead of allowing other people to intimidate us when we make mistakes, then we've got to be allowed to be mistaken. Now, in this, as in much else, of course, philosophy tells us what we already know, but what we've probably overlooked or forgotten that we once knew. Put it slightly differently, and some of you will have heard this refrain before, philosophy, although it's an abstract discipline, is also something that all of us do. Most often, of course, as children, before our parents and teachers can't stand any more of it and tell us to stop asking bloody awkward questions. To that extent, we're all philosophers. And all serious conversation is potentially philosophical. You might even think, like Plato, that at least some philosophical knowledge consists in recalling what in some sense is already known. But I shan't pursue that one. So, having said something about the importance of making mistakes, let me now do something that may well turn out to be a mistake. Although I don't think it is. We'll see. Back to the main thread then. How can I argue for the view I suggested a few minutes ago, that moral and political judgments need to be considered in terms of whether or not they make sense? Well, let me take an example. It's what philosophers do. We usually proceed through example. My example, and of course this is no coincidence, is going to be what I actually do take to be a very curious phenomenon, an irrefutable moral principle, the only such moral principle that I know. And if I'm right about that, it's at the same time an example of moral knowledge rather than moral belief, and also an example of how that knowledge remains substantively negative. That's to say, we know it's true rather than just believing it's true. But even when it's presented as a positive claim, as Kant certainly presents it, the knowledge it gives us is mainly negative. So here it is, the second formulation of Kant's categorical imperative, my favourite sentence in the history of Western philosophy. Act in such a way that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of any other, always at the same time as an end and never merely as a means. Say that again, because it's a bit convoluted. Act in such a way that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of anyone else, always at the same time as an end and never merely as a means to an end. How could anybody deny that principle? This is something I've tried a few times. So far, it's always worked. I've never found anybody who can give me a genuine argument against that principle. What does it say? Let's unpack it a little bit. Why is it so powerful? Kant tells us that to be a person, to be recognized as a person, and not just a member of the species Homo sapiens, is already to have a moral and political status. The status of something that is not here merely as a means to another's or our own ends. If you, a person, deny Kant's principle, then what you're doing is denying your own status as a person. But it's that status as a person that enabled you to make the denial in the first place. So not only is Kant's principle undeniable, at least on pain of practical self-contradiction, but it seems to me to be what I want to call a negative principle. And by that I mean that while it's very hard to see exactly what it rules in, and lots of people from Hegel onwards have pointed that out, it's not difficult to see what it rules out. Again, that answers to what we already know. Of course it's very hard. It might even be impossible to say exactly how people ought to live. I mean, I don't know how to live myself, let alone how anybody else should. Or what precisely our political arrangements ought to be. Of course that's difficult. But it's not particularly difficult to say a great deal about how not to live, or about what our political arrangements ought not to be. And of course, this is where capitalism comes in. Let's see how this rough theoretical framework might help us show what I claim all of us in this room know already, whether we know that we know or not, namely that capitalism is indeed immoral. That's what I'm going to try and do. To begin, and of course this is only a very small beginning, to persuade you that you know that capitalism is immoral, and that you know it's immoral simply because it contradicts Kant's principle. And I'm going to be quite crude about this because, as I've said, I think Wittgenstein's right. This is the best way of trying out an idea to see if it might work. And the idea is this. There are three very simple steps. If Kant's principle is right, then capitalism's immoral. But Kant's principle is right. Nobody else has managed to deny it. So, capitalism's immoral. QED, basta, done. This is just a beginning, of course, an indication. So I'm going to focus, of course, not on the whole of capitalism, which would take days, but about something that I think is central to it. The fact that it's built on the supposition that selfishness inevitably underpins our exchange relations. And the point is very famously put by a brilliant philosopher, Adam Smith, when he said, "It's not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker," and those who know me will understand the significance of that triumvirate, "that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own self-interest. We address ourselves not to their humanity, but to their self-love." Put it in more contemporary terms, those of the notorious Milton Friedman, one of the twin gurus of the neoliberal revolution that we're suffering from, quote, "There's one thing you can trust everybody to do. You can trust everybody to put his own interest above yours." Nice. That's the view that's at the heart of capitalism. People will supply others with what those others need only if it's in their own interest to do so. Altruism won't give you your dinner. You could say, as so many apologists for capitalism have said, that self-love, selfishness, is given in human nature. And I'll come back to that claim that it's in human nature or part of human nature in a moment. Now, I'm not at all sure that there actually is a human nature that's simply given, Hobbes's view. outside structures and outside norms, at least if by human nature you mean anything normative. On the other hand, if human nature is understood as just a biological observation, then that's fine. Human beings, given our biology, require what? Food, water, shelter, and so on. But of course, if that's all the human nature claim amounts to, then the moral and political questions remain of what's to be done about it. In contrast, altruism, selfishness, and all the rest of our moral characteristics, those that are not simply biological, seem, at least to me, to be acquired, or to be learnt, or to be the product of social structures and arrangements, arguably, at least on one interpretation, Rousseau's view. But if that's right, then human nature's plastic, malleable into this or that shape. Still, whatever you might think human nature is, or even if you think that there's no such thing as human nature, it remains one thing to say that this is how people do act, and quite another to say that it's how they should act or ought to act. And what the butcher and baker do, on Smith's account, is not right. It's not right because to the extent that the butcher and the baker provide dinner out of self-love, they're treating their customers merely as a means to an end, namely their own livelihood. Capitalism requires us to be selfish, whether it takes us to be so naturally or not. So, for instance, while some theorists of the current neoliberal revolution think we are naturally selfish, all its practitioners are busy either ensuring that we remain so, thereby, by the way, contradicting their belief in human nature, or are busy recreating us to fit with that image. Think of your own experience over the last 15 or 20 years. In short, capitalism requires us either to remain fundamentally selfish in our dealings with each other, human nature's given, or to become so, human nature's socially constructed. No wonder then that our whole lives are being commodified. We are being made only ever to do what is in our very narrowly construed material interest to do, or in other words, what pays. And often we're being made into that sort of being, the sort of person that capitalism requires, through the pretense that that's what we really are already. Adam Smith's observation, whatever his own view of the scope or the reach of the market, is coming to apply to all our dealings with each other. So it's not a surprise, for instance, that universities are being turned into businesses where knowledge is valued only as a source of income, or that the NHS is being turned into a business where health is something that you can buy or sell. Now, a variant on this view comes from Friedrich von Hayek, the other chief guru of neoliberal capitalism. He's disarmingly frank. Capitalism, he tells us, simply stands outside morality altogether. Quote, "The impersonal process of the market can be neither just nor unjust because the results are not intended or foreseen." That's profoundly stupid. They are intended and they are foreseen. The process is invented and directed by people. The laws of the market are not like laws of nature, but like juridical laws. Furthermore, at the heart of these laws lies a particular conception both of property and of human beings. Human beings whom it takes in crucial respects to be like property, or even sometimes to be property. Now, of course, von Hayek's thinking about the markets being run by the hidden hand is skewed. Of course, it's run by people for their own benefit, and it's not like the laws of physics, it's not like the weather. But much more importantly than that, his conclusion is at least half right in describing how capitalists themselves think of the market, and how they would have all of us think of the market. Namely, that the people engaged in it are fundamentally things, like the wind and the rain. And of course, Neither wind nor rain can be subject to moral or political judgment. So, if you can be persuaded that the market is indeed outside morality and that it concerns not people but things, you won't pester the capitalists by making political judgments about it, and you won't pester them by telling them that they're wrong. And if you can be persuaded also of two more falsehoods, that that's what human nature's like, and furthermore, that it's because human nature unalterable, then so much the better. So let me repeat, one way of understanding Kant's principle that we shouldn't use each other or ourselves merely as means to an end is to notice that people are not things. And from that it follows that we're not property. Now, that's what I want to focus on. This view of what we either are or should be, property, is clearly reflected in the main duty under capitalism of those people, the directors, who run a company. It's simple, it's clear, and it's problematic. Their duty is to maximise profit for shareholders. A director has to act so as to ensure that those with a material interest in the company, those who've invested in it, get their maximum return. It's not their benevolence, but their self-interest, after all, that leads them to make their investment. An investment without which there'd be no company, and so no source of supply for those who are its customers. That self-interest, in turn, has to be satisfied if the investors are not to move their investment elsewhere, and the only way it can be satisfied is through what's called, laughably, a financial return. Think about the language. A return on one's investment. Not getting back what you've lent, which is what one might suppose a return to mean, but rather getting something new. Nothing to do with returning anything, in so-called return for having lent the money to establish the firm or to keep it going. In short, the capitalist firm operates through the idea of people getting paid for having lent some of their money to the firm. It used to be called usury until capitalism overtook Christianity. And of course that term usury is a telling one. Why? Because we don't like to use it in public. 2, because of course the shareholders are literally using those who need their money to make money. It's very hard to think of a clearer example of using people merely as a means to an end. And that's, of course, just the beginning. Having used merely as a means to an end the firm itself, of which they're now part, the shareholders, as part-time owners of the firm, use merely as a means to the end of making a profit both the firm's workers, those who consent, so to be used because they need to make a living, and the firm's customers, who either need or can be persuaded to want the product. It's not the workers or the customers who count. Their role is fundamentally subordinate to the business of making a profit. They are being used merely as a means to that end. Well, that's the outline of an argument. It's only the bare beginnings of an argument. What might be some obvious objections to it? I think there are 2 pretty clear objections to the sort of thing I've just said. First, what I call the fluffy response, the fair trade nonsense, the alternative, for which I have, as I'm sure you know, very little time. Second, perhaps the rather more serious response, which was Adam Smith's, that capitalism is an exchange mechanism and not a way of life. And for that response, though I think it's in the end mistaken, I have some respect. So let me start with the first, because it's more fun. The argument is, well, that's what capitalism used to be like back in the 19th century, but it no longer is. Fair trade, tradecraft, all the rest of the fluffy bit. The Companies Act 2006 is, to quote the lovely bunch of people, the Corporate Responsibility Coalition. Here's what they say about it. It's the biggest shake-up of company law for 150 years. It requires for the first time company directors to consider their business's impacts on people and the environment. It also requires some of the largest businesses to make public these impacts in annual reports." Close quote. So it's not true that directors' duty is simply to maximise shareholders' profits. Again, to quote this wonderful coalition, "They must have regard to a number of matters, such as the likely consequences of any decision in the long term, its employees' interests, the need to foster its business relationships with suppliers and others, and of course, the impact of its operations on the community and environment. This particular duty, set down in an Act of Parliament for the first time, encompasses the concept of enlightened shareholder value." New Labour at its best, ESV. ESV, we are told by these learned people, quote, "requires directors to act in the collective best interests of shareholders." They've been reading Mao again. "Through an inclusive approach," inclusive of course, "that values building long-term relationships and rejects the notion of exclusive consideration of short-term financial benefits." And although there was, and I'm emphasising was, a time when business success was thought to be in conflict with society's aspirations for people who work in the company or in supply chain companies, for the long-term well-being of the community and for the protection of the environment, the law is now based on a new approach, pursuing the interests of shareholders and embracing wider responsibilities are complementary, not contradictory. But that's rubbish. It's mere window dressing, it's mere propaganda for the big society. As Hannah Ellis and Kate Hodgson point out, quote, "ESV assumes that companies whose directors have regard to relevant social or environmental impacts are likely in the long term to perform better than those whose directors do not." So if taking into account the environment makes the company more profitable, then it'll take them into account. But not because to do so is a good thing, but because to do so is a means of furthering its own interests. Take the example of fair trade, giving producers a slightly higher price for their coffee beans or whatever. The producers are still being used merely as a means to the fair trade company's ends, even if they're marginally less abused in the process. Giving a slightly less inadequate price helps sell the product, we all buy it. Done. According to the fair trade people, a fair price, after all, is one that's presumably a little higher than an unfair price. But of course, it's being a little less unfair doesn't make it fair. Now, of course, what, if anything, would count as a fair price is a tricky issue. Here's a suggestion, only a suggestion, a price which enabled the seller to enjoy the same standard of living as the average buyer. Just imagine that for a moment. But the fact that we don't have a clear answer to that question doesn't really matter. It doesn't matter because it doesn't stop us seeing that such and such a price, one that comes nowhere near that, is simply not fair. After all, the producer of the coffee beans matters just as much as you or I. And to abuse people less, or even if that's really what you do think goes on, not to be unfair to people at all, is not of itself to conform to Kant's principle. To use someone merely as a means to an end is a very specific form of abuse. That's why the principle is so important. It's not the same as just being unfair or more unfair or less unfair. It's a much deeper matter. It's a matter of not treating people as people at all. That's to say, Kant's principle does not concern price, whether fair, unfair, or fairer. It concerns our fundamental relationships. And because we're not things, those relationships cannot be understood in terms of price. To make this clearer, let's recall that under capitalism, that price is a fair price which the market will bear. And we all know that every time we get on a train. That's to say, the price for which the producer is prepared to sell, whatever their circumstances, and that which the buyer is prepared to pay, whatever their circumstances. But that's not the real world at all. I know philosophers aren't supposed to talk about the real world, but I'll break that rule. What counts as fairness reflects our respective positions relative to each other. If I'm starving and need a loaf of bread, I'll pay a higher price for it, if I can, than someone who isn't starving, even if that leaves me a lot worse off than the latter person. If the coffee farmer has to sell their beans at a certain price in order to live at all, then that's what they'll do. If they were better off, if they were less reliant on selling their coffee beans, they'd hold out for a higher price. This is all really quite simple. Fairness between equals is one thing. Fairness between unequals, which is what we're talking about, is nonsense and amounts simply to screwing people for whatever you can get out of them. It's the structure of social relations that counts. In this case, the fact that the farmer has no choice but to sell her or his labour. It's that fact that the firm, whether it's fair trade or not, exploits. It uses people, both producers and customers, merely as a means to its end of making money. And the shareholders exemplify the fact. It's what Kant rightly rules immoral. Why? Because according to Kant's principle, we're fundamentally equal. We're all the same sort of thing, namely persons. That's for Kant what equality means. As for its employees' interests, this sudden thing that firms are supposed to be interested in, these remain, of course, defined by the employer. Since the choice is to work or to starve, of course it's in the workers' interests to work. But their interests are interests forced on them, just as their so-called choosing to work isn't really a choice at all, but a necessity. Workers, that's us lot, all of us, are put into a position where we can survive only by agreeing to be used merely as a means to an end, and by using ourselves in the same fashion. But the fact that a state of affairs is necessitated does not change either its moral status or its political meaning. Only the extent to which people are in a position to act in accordance with that status. The fact that someone buys an operation rather than choosing to die does not render their choice right, though it certainly renders it understandable, and in my view excusable, though that opens up the very difficult issue of the extent to which circumstances do or do not take away from moral culpability. In short, the firm effectively owns the worker's labour, and to that extent, the firm owns the workers. As the owner of a chain of lap dancing clubs recently put it, opening a new one in Brighton, when commenting on legislation requiring such clubs to apply for a sexual entertainment licence, this requirement, I quote, deprives him of his possessions. That is more than a metaphor. It's all too literal. Let's go to the second objection, the more serious one. The objection that the relations of self-love or self-interest are limited to the market. This, I think, actually was Adam Smith's view, as Amartya Sen points out. While the passage I quoted from Smith earlier is indeed the most widely quoted one in Smith, as Sen points out, I quote, "In the rest of Smith's writings, there are extensive discussions of the role of other motivations that influence human action and behaviour." But how do we understand that argument? How are we to understand the argument that the market has its limits? Either Adam Smith must think that this is what we're fundamentally like, so that the morality of the market underpins everything else, or that although this is one aspect of human experience, it's not the whole of it. And I think that the scholars who take the generous view, and I'm not an expert on Smith at all, that it's the latter that represents Smith's thinking, I think they're right. Just as the morality of the market is part of our experience, so is, for instance, disinterested altruism. Consider the righteous among nations who hid Jews from Nazi persecutions on mainland Europe during the Second World War. Both of these things have their place. As Jerry Cohen put it rather well, both selfish and generous propensities reside, after all, in almost everyone. As a description, that's fine, regardless of whether you think that these facets of our experience, or of human nature, as some might put it, are in some way given, or that they arise through social structures. But how can this be a defense of capitalism? Either the butcher's and the baker's self-love, and thus you're being treated merely as a means to an end, is confined to a particular context, to a specific game, as Wittgenstein would say, or it isn't. If it is confined to a specific game, then stepping out of such a context would put a stop to it. Being a worker or a customer is only a role that you voluntarily and temporarily take on, in which case, of course, you're not being treated merely as a means to an end, any more than spectators watching football treat the players merely as a means to their end of enjoying the game. Why? Because if somebody's injured, they immediately step out of their role as player, unless they are, and then fill in the number of names that you don't like. And in being medically treated, they cease to be treated merely as a player. But of course, that's not how things are, other than in games. Capitalism is not like football. It's not a game show. It's not a game, significantly and importantly, that we can choose to take part in or not. We cannot simply walk away from capitalism as if it were a game. It's not optional. And that's why, so far as I know, Smith never managed to explain just how, quote, other motivations that influence human action and behaviour relate to the self-love that governs market transactions. But if that's the claim, I think we're owed an explanation of how that's possible. So far as I know, Smith doesn't provide it. So far as I know, no one provides it. So our being treated merely as a means to an end, as worker or customer, is not limited in the way that games are limited. Workers and customers is what we are. But of course, if that's what we are, then we're no longer persons, just because we're being treated merely as a means to an end. That's to say, as not a person at all. Treating people merely as a means to an end is wrong, immoral, if you like, inasmuch as it denies their being persons. Ergo, capitalism remains immoral. Or consider Milton Friedman's variation on this, his wonderful claim. And I'm not making this up. This is what he actually said. Quote, in a free private market, people deal with one another voluntarily, not because somebody tells them or forces them to. If that were the case, it wouldn't be a question of being treated merely as a means to an end, since we'd be freely choosing to deal with one another. Now, at a superficial level, maybe that's true, providing, of course, that you construe free sufficiently ideally so as to rule out any actually existing private market. But of course, that's the point. In the world that we all live in, and I mean all, the capitalist world, the world as it is a world where people do not enter the market as equals. It's a world in which we are constantly told what to do and the terms on which we may do it. And of course, while we may in principle be free not to do as we're told, that freedom is rather like the freedom you enjoy not to jump out of the third floor window when it's the only way of getting out of a burning building. Capitalism treats us merely as means to an end, even if in so-called principle we're free to refuse the bargain. To that extent, this second objection falls on very obvious empirical grounds. But even if it didn't, even if I'm wrong in that empirical point, capitalism still falls foul of Kant. For even if people caught up in the structure of the free private market had entered it as equals, and even if they were in any practical sense free to refuse the bargain, they would still be surrendering their freedom were they to accept it. And this is the sting in the tail of Kant's principle. So to treat humanity, whether in your own person or that of any other, not merely as means to an end. There are some bargains which we're not allowed to enter into, because to do so would be to consent to our treating ourselves merely as means to an end. Even if one does that voluntarily, it is to surrender one's identity, one's nature as a person. Why? Because, as Kant puts it, human freedom consists in obedience to the moral law. Very unfashionable notion, this, but it's true. Freedom's not a matter of doing what you like. Freedom's not just a matter of not being subject to the immediate and direct coercion of another person, as for instance when somebody's being tortured. Otherwise, we'd be consenting to be treated as not people, to be treated as things, property, object. But since we are persons, that makes no sense. It's a practical self-contradiction. Freedom from immediate coercion, one could say, is a necessary but not sufficient condition of being a person. It's needed, but it's not enough. Only if others do not treat us merely as means to an end, and only if we treat neither others nor ourselves merely as means to an end, can we be a person, on Kant's view. That's the whole difference between being a person and being merely a human being, an instance of a particular biological species. Let me put this finally in one other way. To be a person is already to be a moral and political agent. Capitalism requires us to be or to become non-persons. Okay, back then briefly to philosophy. And I've nearly finished, you'll be pleased to hear. I've claimed that doing philosophy can yield knowledge. The claims I've begun to try to outline can be developed, and they can be tested through discussion, debate, argument. If they fail to survive relatively intact such development and testing, then doing philosophy would at least have begun to show that it's not the case that capitalism's immoral. On the other hand, if my claims were to survive such development and testing, and I think they can, but of course I might be wrong, then philosophy, doing philosophy, would have uncovered the knowledge that capitalism is immoral. What matters here is that either way, the knowledge gained would be intensely practical. After all, what could be more practical than the knowledge that capitalism is immoral? Or even, impossibly hard to imagine though this might be, that it's not immoral after all. Thank you.